Hello and welcome to the show, everybody. I am Pete. This is Stand Up. Joining me today, Dr. Peter Hotez and Tim Wise. I'm Pete Dominic. It's time to stand up with me right now. Hey guys, I have an awesome couple of guests joining me today, and I'm happy to have you. There are 16 days until Thanksgiving, 45 days until Christmas. My daughters are already playing Christmas carols in the house. When is I think it's after Thanksgiving should be the rule. I told them they can only play them in their headphones or in their bedrooms. That was really maddening to hear. There are 72 days until Inauguration Day. Learned today that Kimberly Guilfoyle, Donald Trump Jr.'s girlfriend, offered a lap dance at a Trump campaign event to a big donor, according to Politico. That was disturbing and also hilarious. And what some people feared was his preparation to use one of his loyalists to attempt a coup. President Trump today fired his fourth Secretary of Defense, William Esper, by a tweet. Of course, he didn't do it to his face because he's a coward, but his COVID-sick Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, called him, and then he tweeted that he would be appointing the ghost of General Patton. Yeah, that's who he's decided to replace William Esper with. So, no, all joking aside, there is a lot of concern about this. Here is expert historian, Ph.D. on autocracy, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who joined me several times, made a little video on her Twitter account to help give us some understanding and perspective on how this all works, at least based on history's autocrats, dictators, and authoritarians.
You may have heard that Trump fired the Defense Secretary, Mark Esper. This is the start of what I call end-stage follies, crazy things that autocrat and autocrat wannabes do when they feel control is being taken from them, when they feel humiliated because of defeats and they have to save face in the ways they most prefer, which is to humiliate others and fire others. So you're going to see a lot more of this behavior, as well as the propaganda machine telling you that Trump is a victim. This is an old theme, of course, of the Trump cult, but it will be elevated. And in general, anything that will soothe the ego of Trump in this period will be practiced on a large scale. And you may have read news reports that his aides are practically rolling a dice to see who's going to have to break the news to him. And the fact that no one feels comfortable doing this tells you everything you need to know about the dysfunction of the Trump administration, which is typical dysfunction of authoritarian rule. Because although authoritarians like us to believe that their law and order governments are productive and efficient, Mussolini made the trains run on time, in reality they are chaotic and destructive environments. And we have definitely dodged a bullet in not re-electing this one.
NYU historian, author, commentator, and frequent guest here on Stand Up, Ruth Ben-Ghiat. In relation to that, by the way, saw CNN's Jake Tapper tweeting, a senior administration official tells CNN that Defense Secretary Mark Esper, whom President Trump just fired via tweet, is also worried that the president will next fire FBI Director Christopher Wray and CIA Director Gina Haspel. So we're obviously everybody's watching closely to see what happens with the remaining potential firings of other agency and cabinet secretaries, especially those in charge of national security. Speaking of cabinet secretaries, another one of them now has come down with the Rona. It is the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, the man with gifted hands, brain surgeon Ben Carson, apparently has COVID. I got a text from a friend who knows who she is and listener who said, with Ben Carson and Mark Meadows testing COVID positive, aren't they now the executive branch COVIDians? All right, so that's pretty big news. I think Ben Carson might actually be hospitalized. And the other big news from Monday is that Bill Barr, the attorney general, pulled his head from Trump's losing asshole and announced that he told federal prosecutors that they were allowed to investigate allegations of voter fraud before the results of the presidential race are certified. His authorization prompted the Justice Department official who oversees investigations of voter fraud, a guy named Richard Pilger, to step down from his post within hours. So to be crystal clear, in response to Bill Barr's memo authorizing this investigation, the top Department of Justice official overseeing voter fraud investigations actually quit. The New York Times reports Bill Barr's directive ignored the Justice Department's long-standing policies intended to keep law enforcement from affecting the outcome of an election, and it followed a move weeks before the election in which the department lifted a prohibition on voter fraud investigations from before the election. Over on Twitter, Mark Joseph Stern, who covers courts and law for Slate, I really like, tweeted, Republicans are helping Trump create a harrowing atmosphere of very real, deep fear that he might stage a coup. I feel it too. But there is no substance behind his theatrics. There are no remotely plausible scenarios in which he will prevail. He will leave office on January 20th. And to be clear, I absolutely believe there were scenarios in which Trump could steal the election. I wrote about them, but we are not in one. We are not even close. The recent actions of Trump and the GOP are truly odious banana republic stuff, but they won't work. He will leave. I'm very worried about the consequence of Trump and Republicans convincing their voters that Democrats rig elections through mass voter fraud. I'm worried about future elections that are within stealing distance for the Republican Party, but I'm not worried that Trump will steal this one. That's Mark Joseph Stern, who covers courts and law for Slate, tweeting. Elie Mystal agreeing with him, who also covers courts and the law for The Nation magazine. All that said, as the last point made there, 7 in 10 Republican voters I read today from a Morning Consult poll say the 2020 election was not free and fair. Now, that might be because the president himself won't admit defeat and tell his cult followers the truth that it was free and fair and that every election has irregularities and dead people voting and so on. But if you don't have proof that it affected the outcome of any state's election, then you got nothing, pal. You got nothing. And here is a great montage put together by The Daily Show with Trevor Noah on a whole bunch of Republican commentators and others whining and complaining after last time. Listen to this.
Democrats are being sore losers. They refuse to acknowledge they lost the election. So what do? They cry malfeasance, wrongdoing, criminality, fraud.
Democrats, more so than Republicans, seem to have a problem conceding defeat. Either the election system broke down or some mystery votes are hiding somewhere.
You have a whole series of Democrats who've just said bluntly, if our candidate doesn't win, they stole the election.
The Dems just want to make America suffer. It's like losing the World Series and demanding an extra inning a day later.
The Democrats are refusing to accept the declared results of the national media. So how do they do this? Lo and behold, they find missing ballots.
The radical left is attacking the sanctity of our votes,
refusing to accept the midterm election results. So what if these were Republicans refusing to concede?
Democrats may see how they'll be able in the future to steal elections through lawsuits that they can't win with the voters.
Ramping up election conspiracy theories, accusing Republicans of outright stealing the election. Kind of rich. You know what? Sounds sore loserish.
Well, there you go. The Daily Show putting that together, that montage together. And, wow. Have you noticed how good the opening of the show has gotten? By the way, many of you have. But so thank you very much for noticing. But I'm fishing for compliments for others, putting a lot of work in here at the top of the show to give you a roundup of news, analysis, and not really mine. I'll give you my pithy jokes and quick takes, but usually reading other people's tweets and opinions on things, as well as some important audio that I want to share with you. So thank you very much for supporting me on this podcast. I couldn't do it without you, but it's good. I'm getting good at doing this 1 year in here on season 2, I announced. Because it's the second year and, it's the election. I figured I'd call this season 2. And so a lot more people subscribing. Barbara Potter subscribing today saying, hey, Pete, greetings from rural red Washington State. I listened to you on Sirius back in the day and I've listened to your podcast since day one. I wanted you to know that I've wanted to donate and become a subscriber for a long time, but this year's been rough. I need to get my own oxygen mask on before I could help others with theirs. Now the O2 is on board, and I'm happy to subscribe to you officially. I'm not sure why I use the airplane metaphor, but it does seem appropriate. Barbara, thank you very much, and thank you to all of the new subscribers. Why don't I just give you shout outs right now, because several new subscribers over the past few days, and I really appreciate it. Daniel Stern just became a $10 subscriber. Hey, Daniel. Doug Jeffrey, also a $10 subscriber. Kevin G became a $30 patron. Gene Lingelbach is a $5 subscriber. Brendan Wilson signed up. We met Brendan at the last Zoom for $8. He's out there, I think, in the hills in Texas. Serrana Biondo is a $5 subscriber. John Woods is a $5 subscriber. David Gerard edited his pledge up from $20 to $25 a month. You can always do that. You can always edit your pledge up. Corey Fawcett. Harvey just became a $5 patron. Jeff Myers edited his pledge from $10 to $20. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Jeff and his wife live in New Jersey. Beautiful family there, the Myers. Holly Johnson just became a $5 subscriber. Brett Oakes is a $10 subscriber. Susan Vangenhoven is a $10 subscriber. Thank you, Brett and Susan. Kenton Allison, $5. Carla Elio is a $5 subscriber. Cindy K just edited her pledge up again and way up. Thank you, Cindy. Just mentioned Barbara, read her message, and $10 subscriber Terry Ashby. Welcome all of you to the stand-up community, which is growing every day, but we need your support. We need your subscriptions. We need more folks. We need your 5-star reviews on the podcast. If you're listening on Apple, especially, it's kind of the big measure, the big standard for podcasts. And become part of our community. Join us on Zoom Thursday night, everybody. Thursday night, 8 Eastern. We're going to talk about where we are in the election and where we're going from here. Some things I want to do with the podcast, checking in with folks, introducing new folks as well on the Zoom Hangouts. Also, the Discord platform is active all the time. So when I say at the end of the show, as I always do, you're never alone, well, you're not, because there's a whole bunch of awesome people on the Discord platform as well. All right, let me just play a couple more things for you. I've got actually 3 quick clips from Fox News that I think are really important. The first one is the most important one, because I think this is... I've been saying, and other experts have been saying for a long time, that when Trump starts to lose Fox News, that's when you know things are really changing. Obviously, he has now lost the election, and he has lost some of the people in the mainstream or the day side, whatever you want to call it. You know, not Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, and Sean Hannity. Those hours, I think, what are they, 8, 9, and 10 o'clock? But this is Neil Cavuto, who... Fox was airing the press conference or comments from Trump's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, and he just cuts out. You'll hear Kayleigh start talking, and then you'll hear Neil Cavuto when she starts just bullshit and say, I can't do it. Listen to this.
Our position is clear. We want to protect the franchise of the American people. We want an honest, accurate, lawful count. We want maximum sunlight. We want maximum transparency. We want every legal vote to be counted, and we want every illegal vote to be...
I just think we have to be very clear. She's charging, the other side is welcoming fraud and welcoming illegal voting. Unless she has more details to back that up, I can't in good countenance continue showing you this. I want to make sure that maybe they do have something to back that up, but that's an explosive charge to make, that the other side is effectively rigging and cheating. If she does bring proof of that, of course, we'll take you back. So far, she has started saying right at the outset, welcoming fraud, welcoming illegal voting. Not so fast.
Not so fast. What has gotten into Fox News? Wow, they're making some strong editorial decisions over there. And speaking of Fox News, anchor Sandra Smith didn't know that her mic was open and going out over the air when she commented on the fact that her colleague who was on air, Trace Gallagher, did not push back on a guest who was bullshitting for Donald Trump. I think I explained it well. Listen to this.
Whoever is decided to be the president, remember, just because CNN says, or even Fox News says that somebody's president doesn't make them president. So I think everybody wants to know that this was done properly and legally.
What is happening? Like, Trace, we've called it.
And I think we have to look into every one of these concerns.
Yeah, and I think Cleta makes a very good point there, Steve. You know, that look.
Yeah, Trace Gallagher, he's a real douchebag over on Fox News. I got another clip of him, too, because I think this one is really important when we're hearing a lot of the finger pointing in Democratic circles, and you're hearing a lot of the mainstream anchors, especially on the right, but certainly I think, false equivalencyers over on CNN and elsewhere trying to ask these tough questions, which need to be asked, of course. I mean, I understand it, but the way that they're framed are pretty ridiculous on the finger pointing for Democrats on why they lost a few seats in the House. And everybody's pointing to this idea of defund the police. Defund the police really hurt Democrats. I think that there's there's truth to that. I think that there's a lot to say about that. But let's be clear. Democrats did not run on defund the police. It was activists. You can call them progressive activists for sure. But it's the Republican strategists and commentators and the right who tried to paint Democrats as if they were running on defunding the police. Of course, none of the candidates said that at all. And here's Trace Gallagher trying to pin Democratic strategist on admitting that, and he couldn't do a very good job. Listen.
Well, the fact is, what wasn't taken seriously was the tarring done by Republicans using phrases like defunding the police, using phrases like socialism. Democrats didn't take it seriously enough and fight back against it because Democrats weren't saying that. They were saying reform the police. The socialism claims hurt in Miami-Dade like nothing else. So that tells you everything.
Defund the police in Portland, Oregon. A lot of these protesters were saying
name me one member of Congress who used that language. One.
The far left, the Antifa people were using defund the police. Political members in Portland, in Seattle, police chiefs up and down the West Coast were using the thing.
You can't answer it, Trace. I understand.
Okay. Marianne Marsh, David Avella, good to see you. Thank you both.
Oh, Marianne Marsh, good job. You're probably not going to be invited back anytime soon, but that's why doing something like something like that is courageous. Well done. I thought that was awesome. And I think it's an important point for people to understand that Democrats weren't running on defunding the police on that idea and weren't saying it, and we're pushing back on it. Okay, so I have one more very special clip to play for you before I get to my first guest, Dr. Peter Hotez. And this comes from, I was listening to the New York Times Daily podcast while I was outside cleaning up the lawn on a lovely 75-degree Monday, November afternoon in the Northeast. And this is from the Monday episode of the New York Times, The Daily podcast. It's titled Celebration and Sorrow, where they sent the reporters around the country to capture reactions on a divided nation. And they introduced their listeners to this reverend who is in South Carolina, and black woman reverend. And I was just so blown away by her performance here that I had to share this with you. Thank you to the New York Times for finding her. But I wanted to share. This is Reverend Telly Lynette Gadsden in South Carolina. She just goes by Pastor T. Here is a little bit of her live stream preaching on Sunday after the election was finally called. I don't much care for church, organized religion, but I certainly do love the performances in the black church.
They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. I want to say to President-elect Joe Biden, 78, gonna look great on you, sir. I see your mojo is still working. I believe that there's a woman named Kamala Harris that would declare to us, good black, it just don't crack. And it doesn't matter when they count you out because they can't count. Hashtag count every blessing. Name them one by one. I believe I can hear from the balcony of heaven. Don't let anybody steal your possibility. I hear Martin say, King me. Sojourner say, tell the truth. Barbara say, cross Jordan. I heard Barack say, yes we can. I heard Michelle say, when they go low, we go high. Is there anybody here that heard Kamala say, excuse me, but I am speaking? It's a paraphrase of let the redeemed of the Lord say so. If you're blessed this morning, you ought to throw up some hearts and let the world know that I am blessed from the crown of my head to the sole of my feet. I am blessed, and I won't let anybody steal my possibility. I got to count every blessing.
I like that. Count every blessing. Won't let anybody steal my possibility. Pastor T is her name. Reverend Telly Lynette Gadsden in South Carolina. Thanks to the New York Times, courtesy to them and their producers for finding that clip. All right. And finally, I just want to say again, thank you very much for listening to the podcast. I really appreciate it. We'll meet up on Thursday at 8 Eastern. I'll put the link in the Patreon post, and you get that if you sign up at the paid subscription link in the show notes, or just go to patreon.com/Pete Dominic and sign up now, because you get the podcast every day. Of course, it's free, but it ain't cheap to produce, so I could really use your support. And there's an amazing community that comes along with it. Cindy, who I mentioned earlier, editing, her monthly subscription way up, also sent me an email with it saying that it's a pretty important early Christmas gift, the subscription raising. But she wrote, you know, Pete, I can't tell you how much it means to connect with people, especially at my age. But through you, I now have several people I can call friends. And it's because of you. I'm even going to meet in real life with one. I've had several talks with others. You, sir, have made a difference in my life. So I want you to know that. Thanks for everything. Cindy K in Illinois. Cindy, thank you. All of you have made a huge difference in my life, getting to know you, connecting with you, never feeling alone. And what you get is access to these brilliant people who I speak to every day and share those conversations. And I've been doing this for a really long time, so I have a long list of people that I can reach out to, and new people I'm developing relationships with all the time. But one of the people who I reached out to a long time ago to debunk this theory that vaccines cause autism is a guy who makes vaccines and whose daughter Rachel has autism. He wrote a whole book. It's titled Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism. That's the title of the book. He's got a new book coming out as well. It's called Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science. So important, so relevant. He's a scientist, a researcher, an author. He explains science in such an effective way. We had a great conversation. I should probably mention he's a professor at Baylor University. He's affiliated with so many different organizations and universities that it would take me too long to read it all off. He's just one of the most in-demand guests that you can have as a source on your show, radio, TV, podcast. And the fact that he agrees to do mine on a moment's notice, by the way, is the power of the show and my network. And that is what you are paying for, because I have the long-form conversations with experts that you are going to want to hear from, and conversations that you can understand and relate to and share, of course, in podcast form easier than ever before. All right, here now at Peter Hotez on Twitter, my conversation with Dr. Peter Hotez. All right, I've got him now, and I'm really excited to have him. I'm sure as a result of the news that President-elect Biden announced his COVID task force, the press release about Pfizer on progress with the vaccine, that you, sir, have received thousands of interview requests. So thank you so much for taking a few minutes to talk to me. You're making me look very good, Dr. Peter Hotez. Thank you.
I always enjoy talking to you, and you were with me from the very beginning, so I always remember that.
I'm good at finding smart people. That's all I'm good at. So thank you. All right. So you tweeted earlier, this is where I want to start, not with the vaccine, not with the task force, but basically where we're at and how bad things are. You tweeted the most important story of the week, not the company press release, not even the advisory task force, which is a strong group. It's the humanitarian tragedy now unfolding across the middle part of our country as we head towards 200,000 cases daily, 400,000 deaths by February. First, Dr. Hotez, can you be more specific than just that tweet here with me?
Well, the added part is no one seems to give a crap. I mean, we're seeing this slaughter going on. I mean, I'm so upset about it. I mean, the numbers are just accelerating. We're well over 100,000 new cases per day. Regularly now, 120, 130,000 new cases. We'll get to 200,000 new cases. And the reason that matters is because we're starting now to see these surges in the upper Midwest and in El Paso, Texas, all the middle part of the country. It's all flyover nation, right? So it gets mostly ignored that it's in the middle part of the country. And what you're seeing is surges on ICUs and emergency rooms. And the reason that's important is that's when the mortality goes up. That's when the deaths go up. That's what happened in New York in March and April when you're hearing the sirens day and night. It was hospitals getting overwhelmed. Then the death rates go way up. That's what happened in Europe. And it's what's happening now. The difference is there's a lot of distraction because of the election and what's going on and everything else. And so raising awareness and getting people to care about it has been really tough, especially in, places like Texas and North Dakota, South Dakota. I mean, no one seems to care a lot about those parts of the country.
Also, it would seem that apparently we don't have adequate testing, and we may be missing a vast majority of infections. So the true number of infections is actually closer to 300 or 400,000. Is that right?
Oh yeah, that's very fair.
Oh dear,
absolutely. And so the question is, what do we do? Obviously the news today that maybe there's some promise with a vaccine, but that's one of the toughest vaccines to scale up and produce and requires minus 94 degrees freezer temp. So, it's not the kind of thing you're going to walk at the Rite Aid and get.
Oh, wow.
So it's one of the more complicated vaccines. Others are going to follow, maybe even better ones, but and we'll talk about what people should do. But it's not like we're going to vaccinate the whole country in the next few weeks. That's not good. So we're not going to vaccinate our way out of the deaths right now.
But you also said, getting back to where we're at right now and the way that people should be seeing the urgency of right now and the numbers and the spike and for a number of reasons, as you already said, and others, we just aren't paying enough attention to it. You said on Twitter, we need a supreme commander, like right now. What are you talking about, Dr. Hotez? Like right now, what should we do without a vaccine and at this weird lame duck session where we've got Trump still in office, still in charge?
Well, there's two parts to that. I mean, first of all, who does this? I mean, there's a lot of confusion. It's not going to come out of the White House, right? Because there's all the Scott Atlas disinformation, and they're not going to take this on.
Scott Atlas, the radiologist who Trump saw on Fox News and put in charge. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, it's not so much that he's a radiologist. He's been downplaying the epidemic, attributing the deaths to other causes, and these weird herd immunity ideas that are not part of the mainstream science, and dismissing masks. And then, so it's not going to come out of the Trump administration. And then the Biden administration, of course, can't do much yet, right? And even, the task force today, I love those guys. I mean, these are some of the really great science and health policy people in the country, but it's very Acela corridor and West Coast, right? I mean, who now? I mean, what has to happen is we need really important conversations with the governors, and let's face it, they're mostly red states, not all, but a lot of red states, and who bought into the idea that COVID-19 is a hoax or it's been overdone. Who has that conversation? And I don't have the answer, but I think a couple of things should happen. I think the Biden administration needs to bring in some really prominent Republicans who people will listen to. I think that's going to be really critical. And also bringing in a CDC director who's going to be a strong player. I think I used the term Supreme Allied Commander, or I don't know, Field Marshal or whatever, but somebody's really strong to take this on. And we got to do fast. I mean, I'm just devastated by, you see the train coming, you see the loss of lives piling up. And
so your criticism of Biden's task force is that the people from the right parts of the country are not on the task force, the parts of the country that are really suffering right now, and they need people who can communicate in a way to say these Republican governors, Republican legislatures, and Republicans in those states that they will listen. Would you have taken a position on Biden's task force, Dr. Peter Hotez?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And, I don't know how effective I'd be, but, I'm happy to help, and I don't have to be on the task force. I'm happy to help in any way I can. And as I said, the task force, it looks like it'll have more of an advisory role in any case. So I don't know that they'll be the implementers. I'm not exactly sure what the role of the task force is, but it's going to be a matter of really bringing in some strong individuals coming from who the red state governors and the elected leaders in the red states have respect and are going to listen to. I heard something about bringing on Mitt Romney, which is fine. I don't know that he's necessarily the one, but we're going to have people like that in a hurry.
Well, if people like to be told what to do in a gentle, thoughtful tone.
And again, it's I usually am not so direct, but I just see the lives being lost.
Yeah, I appreciate your directness.
And it's breaking my heart. I mean, just to see this.
So the issue, though, is it would seem somewhat political or psychological. When you look at the results of the election, it would seem that the areas that were most affected by coronavirus still voted for President Trump. And I'm not sure I'm drawing this right conclusion, but the issue might be that people don't like these shutdowns, these lockdowns. What would you say to these governors? What should they be doing, Dr. Hotez, in light of the numbers, the increasing numbers in their states?
Look, nobody likes shutdowns or lockdowns, and we need to keep them to a minimum, if at all. And maybe not a total shutdown, but we need to look at the parts of the country or the local areas, some of the cities, where the surges are starting to happen, and where the heads of the hospital is going to say that we're going to get overwhelmed, because the numbers show that as you start getting overwhelmed, that's the mortality goes up from like this to straight up, right? The deaths really pile up, and we need to slow down those surges. So it can be surgical. It doesn't have to be for a whole state or a whole part of the country, but we're going to have to look at that really soon. And it seems to be the colder months are driving this quite a bit.
What would you say to those who would argue, well, we've learned a lot about how to treat it. It's not as dangerous. It's not as killing or even making as many people sick.
It's still a high mortality rate. We've done a few things to reduce mortality in terms of anticoagulant therapy. We know this causes a lot of clotting defects. We know about putting patients on dexamethasone. When we have some monoclonal antibody available, that seems to have an impact. So those things are helping, but who wants to go through that, right? Who wants to go through an ICU admission where your chances of dying have gone down from whatever it is, 30, 40% to below 10%. So there's still a lot of deaths. And the projections are accurate at 400,000 deaths, doubling the number of American deaths the week after the inauguration. So the good news is things will get better, right? We'll start to have vaccines by the spring. We've got the White House that's taking this epidemic seriously. You've got a very strong COVID-19 task force that is going to provide sound advice that's science-driven, evidence-based, great people on there. But right now, we've got a focused national crisis that's not being addressed.
I've got to ask you about President Trump's comments. I think they were last week, where he said that doctors were making a lot of money off of COVID. It's my understanding that hospitals are losing a tremendous amount of money because they can't perform the type of elective surgeries that bring in the most profits. How are hospital systems and doctors faring during this pandemic? And of course, the other issue is people that have other health issues and emergencies are not able to get taken care of because these urgent care hospitals and physicians and nurses, the whole healthcare system is overrun with this virus. How did you react to President Trump and a lot of people agreeing with him, by the way, his supporters in the Republican Party, especially, going on TV and saying, yeah, the doctors are making money?
Yeah, every hospital I know that has made a commitment to COVID-19 is hemorrhaging like crazy, to the point where it's going to disrupt the whole health system. That's how bad things are. So I don't know where he gets that from. It's just made up.
Well, I want to ask you finally about this vaccine that we heard about today from Pfizer and what we need to understand. They announced Monday that an early look at data from their vaccine, their coronavirus vaccine, shows it's more than 90% effective, much better than expected efficacy if the trend continues. The Lord himself, Dr. Anthony Fauci, said Pfizer's results are extraordinarily good news. By the way, do you like Fauci? Do you have any criticism of how he's handled things, Dr. Hotez?
Well, he's a mentor. So
great.
I've known him for 40 years. So he's been a huge supporter of mine. He's helped me a lot. And
you probably respect him so much you wouldn't even criticize that pitch he threw. You'd probably say, you know what, listen, we don't win them all.
Exactly. They clearly moved home plate.
How do you react to the news today from Pfizer about this phase 3 trial?
Well, first of all, it's a press release, right? And I always tell people, be mindful of press releases. The press releases are not being written for you, Pete, or me. They're being shareholders of Pfizer. And that's who they're meant for. And I'm a little unhappy with the pharma CEOs because they're sending out these press releases with the tone deafness that we're in a national homeland security crisis right now. And it's created a lot of issues. And so not this one so much, but the ones in the past have actually enabled the anti-vaccine movement. It's fed into everything that they claim. So it's a press release. It looks promising, but we still have a ways to go. We still have to finish the trial, more volunteers to confirm the safety. Also, I don't know if that 90% is 90% mild infection. Is it severe infection? I have a feeling it's the former. So we have to show that it works against sick people. You remember the Monty Python skit about disarming a man with fresh fruit. So, we want to disarm, sticks and stones, right? Not fresh fruit. We want that works, for severe illness. So that's issue number one. Issue number two, this is one of the more problematic vaccines to make a lot of. It's it's a new technology that's never been used before to license a human vaccine. It also requires minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's not going to be easy to distribute. So it's an exciting first step. I think other vaccines are going to come along. The one question that I get asked is, and I always think it's important to answer, so I'm going to ask it and then I'm going to answer it, is hey, Dr. Hotez, which vaccine are you waiting for? And the answer is I'm not waiting. I'm really upset about what's happening in the country now, especially the middle part of the country as COVID-19 accelerates. I think it's borders on a humanitarian catastrophe. I want virus-neutralizing antibodies in my system. By that, I mean all the vaccines, whether it's the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna or our vaccine that we're producing 1 billion doses in India now, which is really exciting.
Vaccine, the one that you're working on.
Yeah, they all induce virus-neutralizing antibodies because that's the one thing we know, aside from masks and social distancing, that can save your life. And therefore, I will take any vaccine that's authorized by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Even if it turns out it's not the best vaccine, I don't care. I want my virus-neutralizing antibodies in my system to keep me out of the hospital or the ICU. And later, if better vaccines come along, you know what? I'll get a boost with those vaccines. But don't wait. Get whatever you can to protect yourself and your family.
Any questions I didn't ask that I should have asked?
I think that's this is a scary time, and I'm worried that we're going through a level of unprecedented political instability, and we're doing it in part. And this is happening in part because we're such a divided nation right now. And all I'm asking is to figure out a way to for the next few weeks and months to figure out a way to have a bipartisan initiative to save lives in the middle of the country.
Real quick, how important is it that the United States rejoins the World Health Organization that President Trump has taken us out of? Why does that matter? And is it important that we rejoin?
Well, it's important we rejoin because, first of all, the WHO in many low and middle income countries is all we have to help people. So that's absolutely a priority. So I've been a big proponent of that, as well as joining the COVAX sharing facility for vaccine distribution. But anyway, thanks for having me to.
Yeah, of course. I just want to read this.
Vent on this crisis. The other piece to this is we're seeing this historic decimation of Hispanic communities as well. And that's the other piece we're not really talking about. That we know in the Latino community, the percentage of deaths under the age of 65 is 35%. it's not, so it's mothers and fathers of teenagers who we're losing in huge numbers right now. And I tried to testify to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, did that a few weeks ago. But that's the other group we have to really look out for. So El Paso is just getting really hit hard right now, in southern New Mexico as well.
Hey, if there's anybody in that community that you think I should be talking to, I would be happy to talk to them. And I want to just echo, someone wrote this about you on Twitter. So here at the end, I think you are a national treasure. I think that this person wrote, thank you for your humility, your kindness, and your willingness to make us a healthier, better, educated America. I've known you a long time, and you are the doctor that we need right now out there talking in the way that you do as often as you do. Thank you so much for your service to the country and your continued pursuit on a vaccine and your time today with me.
Well, thanks for giving attention to this. I can always count on you for reliably getting good scientific information out there. Pete, you've been terrific from day one.
Dr. Peter Hotez, everybody. Thank you, sir. That was awesome. That was awesome because he said nice things about me, and that's good for my credibility. So if you don't know, that's the type of guests I look for, and that's what they find in me because I trust their expertise. They're scientists. They use evidence-based science to prove their science. That's how science works. Actually, I don't know how science works, but I do know enough to find the people who do. So, awesome guest, and the reason to get a paying subscription if you haven't already. Those are the types of people that I can get on. You know, CNN gets them on, and all the networks get him on. He goes on Fox, he goes on MSNBC, he does all types of interviews all the time. He's a source for science journalists around the country, and he's right here on Stand Up saying those nice things about me and the community who supports this show. So, that's awesome. I'm really happy that he joined me. Also, one of my all-time favorites now, joining me is Tim Wise. Tim is an author and a speaker and a commentator on all things dealing with race. He's an anti-racist. We've heard that term a lot. Ibram X. Kendi wrote a book about it. But Tim Wise has been an anti-racist speaker and author even before I think Ibram Kendi came out of grad school, I think. The point is this guy's got a lot of credibility. He looks at things from the point of view of a white man and how to talk to white people about these issues. And I can't get enough of him. And he's got a new book out, which is called Dispatches from the Race War. It's an anthology of his essays that we talk about right here at the top. And I don't have a date for this yet, but we are going to do a talk about this book. So I highly recommend that you get it, that you read these essays, and that you join me for a Zoom chat with Tim Wise. And I'm also the publisher just told me we'll be able to give 5 books away. As soon as I have a date for you on that, I will let you know. We'll give away some of those books, but I highly recommend, as a way to support Tim Wise, who joins me often here on the show, you get that new book, pre-order it right now. All right, here he is. He's on Twitter at Tim Jacob Wise. He's always brilliant, articulate. I always learn so much from him. One of my wife's all-time favorites, Tim Wise. All right. Well, I've got him now. And as I said, he's one of the people that I really wanted to talk to this week for a number of reasons. Tim Wise joining me. Tim, great to see you. And congratulations again on the new book, which people can pre-order now. Dispatches from the Race War. Thank you for joining me.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
Quick, just a synopsis of your new book. It's a collection of some of your most important, best essays over what period of time?
Really, since the night of the Obama election, so election night of 2008, up until, I think I put the finishing touches on it in September, late September of this year. So the idea was to track the arc of race and politics since the Obama era through the Trump era into this ridiculous year of 2020, and sort of show both the continuity, right, the consistency of race as the background noise of just about everything that happens in America, but also to show, how easy it is to go from the sort of optimism of hope and change and post-racialism, which was the big, rhetoric back after Obama's election, to the depths of despair and resurgent white nationalism and xenophobia and overt racism today, just to show like this is a constant, but also things do go from bad to worse, and we have to be able to meet that moment, the moment that we're in right now, with equanimity, which means confronting the history of racism and how it's brought us to this point.
when you describe that kind of window of how things go on racial injustice, racism, however we want to describe it, I think it's also important, and I know that you shared this tweet and a lot of people did, to recognize that things weren't great before. So getting back to, quote, normal is really not good for a huge segment of this population. Fair to say? How would you phrase?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, all of the problems that have been magnified and have been brought into stark relief, perhaps for some, by the Trump administration were problems during the Obama years. They were problems during the Clinton years, the Bush years 1 and 2. They've been problems. I was born in 1968. They were problems then. I mean, I have a copy of the cover of Time magazine that came out the day that I was born. So I was born October 4th of 1968, which was a Friday. And that was when Time and Newsweek used to release their new editions. That particular edition of Time, which I'm looking at right now because I have a picture of it that is supposed to be framed on my wall, but I haven't framed it. It's a picture of a cop. It's a caricature of a cop, like a cartoon picture. And on the front, it says Law and Order, because it was referring to the uprisings that had been taking place in this country since, the mid 60s. And I'm thinking to myself, like, all that shit, right? That was the stuff then, so much of which had to do with racial injustice, is still the stuff now. So that's not to say elections don't matter. It's not to say, Trump was not worse in many ways, right? It is to say that the underlying stuff that was brought into such clear focus by the Trump administration was there, maybe a little blurrier for some people, but it was there before. The wealth disparities, the unemployment ratios 2 to 1, black folks, brown folks twice as likely to be out of work as white folks, even when they have college degrees. That stuff was happening before. It's going to be happening after, unless we decide that racial justice is a priority issue. And unless the Democratic Party leadership decides that confronting racial inequity is going to be a top priority moving forward.
What do you think, or how do we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, which there was such amazing resurgence in over the summer as a result of George Floyd in Minneapolis? It had been going on for years, however, and the public approval was not very high on it. Obviously, with progressives and with people of color, it was. But something changed over the summer. And I guess I thought we would see that reflected in the election to some extent, or in polling. And some people talk about this phrase that a lot of people came away with, its branding, defund the police, did damage. How does kind of the movement matter? How does the messaging matter? And how did it show up in the election?
Well, we're not going to know for sure what the effect of any of it was on the election until we really have a chance to go through some of the exit polls, which probably are going to be hard to parse, given that a lot of it's mail-in ballots and absentees and stuff. But look, here's the thing. Two things are true, and they can both be true at once, right? Number one, if it's not for the Black Lives Matter movement and the racial justice uprising after the killing of George Floyd, injecting progressive enthusiasm into politics in this moment, Joe Biden's not going to win. He's not going to win. If there is not that focus on racial justice, and which usually will hurt whoever's in charge of the country if they're not taking care of business, if that's not happening, Donald Trump is going to win re-election. So anyone that wants to blame BLM, anybody that wants to blame the activists in the street for this thing being so close, is missing the point. If they're not in the street getting young people to go ahead and say, you know what, maybe I'm not super enthusiastic about Joe Biden, but we got to get this guy out of office so that we can breathe and then move forward politically, so that we can actually build power to do something and have some chance of getting some kind of reform. If that doesn't happen, I'm telling you right now, Donald Trump's going to win. So there might be a handful of congressional reps who are trying to blame, BLM and defund the police and the slogans and all of that for how close their elections were, as I know one of the reps in Virginia's done. But that's absurd. The Democratic Party never ran on socialism. They never ran on defund the police. They didn't run, they didn't make Patrisse Cullors the running mate. You know what I mean? Like, and Patrisse is a friend. I love her. But I mean, like, that's not who they ran with. Right. So the idea that you can blame BLM, that you can blame Alicia Garza, that you can blame activists for the fact that certain lackluster centrist Democrats almost didn't win re-election, or that some of them got beat. The ones that ran on Medicare for all didn't lose. right? The ones that ran in these swing districts that actually took progressive stances, they didn't lose. So we got to be real careful. This firing squad stuff where everybody wants to try to blame the left or blame the movement. If it's not for the movement, if it's not for black folks leading the struggle for racial justice, Joe Biden's done, because the enthusiasm levels for him were just not there.
Right.
And so that's not to say that we don't have to think about messaging. You know, I've said for a long time that, I use the term depolicing rather than defund. And I know to some people that may seem like that's not much of a difference, but I think it is, because depolicing means reducing the footprint of law enforcement in our day-to-day lives, right? That means turning over to other folks who are far more qualified to deal with certain things, whether that's mental health emergencies, whether that's domestic violence incidents, lots of things that cops frankly don't do very well and have no business trying to deal with because they're part of the problem. They're implicated in it. We can talk about it that way. And I think that those slogans are not going to resonate with everybody right away, but we have to challenge the idea that police are the solution to dysfunction. Police are coming in on the back end to deal with stuff that if we were taking care of business on the front end, they wouldn't have to deal with. Right. That's the kind of society that we need. And that's what depolicing is about.
I wonder if what you think or how you would make this example better. But real quick, if you don't mind me running by what I told my daughter when she was asking me, what does that mean, defund the police? I was like, well, it's not very good messaging, because you think of those three words, it makes you think that we're not going to have any police anymore. But what it means is to say, instead of having two police officers respond to a 911 call where someone says, my son is mentally ill, he is having all these, he's saying crazy things, he might hurt himself, I need you to come over. What we do is we, instead of sending two police officers, we send one police officer and one mental health social worker, a psychologist, and they respond. The psychologist handles it, and if it becomes violent, then the police officer can help. But that it's a way of changing the budget and changing how we react to, say, 911 calls and crime in general. What do you think of that idea of explaining to your kids that way as a policy? What would you change about that? And is that what we're trying to do?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, and look, different people have different views about it. I mean, there are some folks that just straight up say, like, yeah, abolish the cops and get rid of all law enforcement.
Sure, yes.
I don't think that's where most folks are. And I know that even the people who are there generally don't say, like, tomorrow, fire everyone and we just sort of take our chances. Right. I don't think that's where anyone really is. But regardless of where you are on that spectrum, let's at least have a conversation. We have created a society that relies on police, most of whom, by the way, have a high school diploma. No offense meant to people that didn't go to college, but if you only have a high school diploma, you don't know how to deal with mental health emergencies because you haven't been trained to do it. You might have gone to college and still not know how to do that unless you studied the right subjects. You don't know how to deal necessarily and intervene in domestic violence situations. And we know cops have some of the highest rates of domestic violence in their own homes in the entire country. So why are we turning the investigation of domestic violence over to people who, frankly, don't have a real good record with that? And the women who were disproportionate, the victims of that, talking about how sometimes they call the cops and the cops re-victimize them, either physically or emotionally, in terms of the way that they interrogate the women who are either the victims of domestic assault or rape and sexual assault. So we're talking about changing the paradigm from law enforcement to public safety, right? Law enforcement, that paradigm by definition says control, dominate, right? Subordinate people. Public safety says what is in the interest of the public? How do we create a safer society? And 90% of that is going to be on the front end. 90% of that is going to be putting money in mental health services, putting money into jobs, putting money into education, putting money into alternative dispute resolution, restorative justice programs, things that are going to actually benefit folks on the front end, reduce crime and victimization so that we don't need to send in people with guns and badges to take care of the problem on the back end. That's the kind of thinking, though, that we will never have if we continue to have politicians who say we need 1 million more cops on the street and we gotta get tough with the lawbreakers. You got to ask why we have so many. Why is America such a violent country compared to the rest of the world, right? The good news is crime is down, contrary to popular belief, by over 40,
in cities
50%.
Across the country that he demagogues and demonizes, crime is actually down. Yeah.
It's been falling. It's fallen consistently. The most violent period in the last, in most of our memory is in the early 90s. The early 90s, crime was considerably worse. It has fallen consistently for the last 30 years, but still we have a much more violent society than most countries. Why is that? Well, part of the reason is we don't invest the money on the front end.
Right.
We don't try to take care of business on the front end. We try to control it on the back end, and it doesn't work.
So well explained. I wanted to have a conversation with you about how I'm supposed to have a better conversation about race. I learn things, I apply them, and sometimes I toss them out. I get reactive, I get judgmental, I make all kinds of assumptions, and I think I often fail, which is one thing to do when you're privately, when you're talking to your family or friends. It's another thing to do when you're talking into a microphone in front of an audience. I always want to try to do better. How do you look at, you're an anti-racist educator, speaker, author. You've been doing this work forever. You go into all kinds of different organizations and companies and help them understand how to have the conversation. I've had that with you before, but in terms of where we are at now, Tim, it seems different because by every definition I understand of a racist or a white nationalist or a white supremacist, Donald Trump is that. But yet he's got 70 million people who will argue otherwise or don't understand that. Or how do we talk about race and racism with someone who defends their support for Donald Trump?
Right. Well, it's hard. Look, I mean, it's easy to be judgmental, and it's not wrong to be when people vote to empower the kinds of people that would strip children from their families, with over 500 of them possibly never to be reunited now, the kind of folks that would say that there were good folks on the side of Nazis in Charlottesville, the kind of folks that would say that a Mexican-American judge can't fairly adjudicate a case against a fake-ass university because they're Mexican-American. Like, at some point, when you call certain countries of color shithole countries and say we need more Norwegians and less people from Haiti, you're a racist. And if you're going to vote for that, you deserve to be judged. And this is also true. I have to try to remember, as difficult as it is, how those 70 million people differ internally. They're not all the same, just like the folks that voted for David Duke in 1990 and 91, which is where I got my start, was fighting those, those races that Duke was in. In Louisiana in 1991, there were 675,000 folks, all of them except for like two black guys were white, right? I mean, there's always two, right? But the rest of them were white. And 675,000 white people voted for a Nazi. And it's not like they didn't know he was a Nazi. Everybody knew. There were children in utero. They knew. Everybody knew that this man was an actual Hitler worshiping Nazi. And they still were like, but I think I'm going to vote for him anyway. I had to sit there, as we all did, and try to figure out, like, what does that mean? Do I actually think there are 675,000 Nazis in Louisiana? No, we have a lot of problems down there at the time, but we didn't have 675,000 Nazis. Now, then the question was, how do I deal with the fact that there are 675,000 people willing to vote for a guy who is? I could decide to say they're all horrible people, and I'm going to write them off entirely. And a lot of them, I would say that's what you got to do. Like, a lot of them, absolutely. But here's the thing. I remember there was one guy, and I may have told you this story, and if so, forgive me, and I hope your audience will as well. But there was a guy that I had sat with. I had done organizing with him around some environmental issues in Destrehan, Louisiana, just down the road, down the river from New Orleans. Mm-hmm. White dude, fighting a grain elevator, some company that was polluting the water supply. And he would work hand in glove with some of the black folks also in Destrehan who were also being poisoned. We had sat at this guy's dinner table. We had talked about strategy, black folks, white folks in his house, talking about how they were going to come together to fight this corporation that was poisoning them all. And then I'm sitting there in the anti-Duke work that I was also doing at that time, going through David Duke's financial election, the state election commission reports in 91, to see people who had donated to him. And I come across the name of this white guy who had given David Duke $200 he did not have, because this guy didn't have a lot of money by any stretch. And I'm thinking to myself, what the hell does that mean? Right. That this guy who can sit there and make common cause with black folks over a common issue, nonetheless gave money to a Nazi. I couldn't hate him in that moment, because I understood there's something about this guy's life and this society that is turning him into this person. There are some folks like that you got to cut loose, but I have to believe there are also some that we can talk to. So the only advice I have is to try to say, listen, we got to be hard on systems and soft on people whenever possible. We can't always do it. Nazis, straight up Nazis and overt racist and people that, do overtly hostile things. Nah, man, you gotta move on. And if we have to shame you, and if we have to get your job taken from you as a cop or a teacher or a doctor, then that's what we're going to do. But for the others, we have to remember, like, people come to this place because the society encourages all these biases. We're all hit with these stereotypes from an early age. We're hit with these racist messages from an early age. We have a society that encourages us to look down on the people at the bottom of the society because our mentality says, well, wherever you end up is all about you. So if you work hard, you can make it. And then we look around and we see black and brown folks disproportionately down here. And some of the white folks are going to go, well, there must be something wrong with them. Right. And then, oh, well, these white folks are up here. Well, they must be superior. That doesn't justify that conclusion. It's still a crazy, wrong conclusion, but it's logical for people. So we have to critique the system that's producing that mentality, right? Not just the people who manifest the mentality. Because if we don't get hold of the system that produces it, we're just going to have more people rocking that mindset and it'll never go away.
But how is it my fault that I'm a racist? I don't know any of the things that you're talking about that you teach. I don't live in a very diverse community. I'm surrounded by people who think like me and worship like me and watch a lot of the same things. I mean, frankly, that is where I grew up in Marcellus, New York. It was very homogenous. Yeah. So how can it be my fault? I don't even know what the fuck you're talking about. I don't know what the problems are. I've never experienced them. I don't see them. I'm not racist. Okay.
It's not your fault to have those views if you have them, but it is to open yourself up to the possibility that precisely because you were in a certain setting, you might have missed some stuff. That's all it is, right? Really what we're asking people to do is have enough humility to say, you know what? My world is not the world. Right. So if I grew up in a place where I didn't see certain things, it's not my fault that I don't see them. Right. It's like I always joke about obliviousness and we're all oblivious to something. I'm oblivious to calculus because I never took that shit. You know why? Because they didn't make me take it. Right. Because the Nashville school system was like, it's all right. You don't have to take it. I'm like, good. I'm not signing up for the abuse. Right. I wasn't going to volunteer. So because I never took it, though, if I were to start doing calculus in the middle of one of my talks, anybody that had ever taken it would be like, he does not know what the hell he's talking about. Exactly. So I'm going to keep my mouth shut about the shit that I didn't learn. Right. But on the other hand, everybody has an opinion about black and brown folks that they haven't been around. Everybody has an opinion about people of color that they don't know. Right. And so white folks have got this opinion about, well, I know when racism is happening. Well, how would you know if you grew up and didn't have to think about this and didn't see it happening to your friends and colleagues and associates and family and people around you, then how would you know? It's not about saying you're a bad person. It's about saying that when you don't have to know something, the odds are you won't know it. And it's not just racism, right? It's like if you think about sexism, for example, we'll take an easier example, disability, right? For people who are able-bodied, I don't have to know about the barriers that people with disabilities face. I don't have to think about that shit. I just get in my car and go. I go to the mall. I don't have to worry if, I got to park 20 extra feet away. No big deal. I go into the building. Are there ramps? Who cares? I don't have to think about any of that, right? That doesn't make me a horrible person. It doesn't mean that I'm ableist and I woke up in the morning and thought to myself, how can I participate in the oppression of disabled people? But it simply means that I have the luxury, indeed the privilege, of not thinking about some shit. And so then when someone who is disabled raises their hand and says, hey, you know what, this ableism thing is real, I need to keep my mouth shut and not say, well, I don't know about that. Maybe you're exaggerating. Maybe you're playing the disability card. Shut up. And I wouldn't do that. That's the thing. Like nobody would even think to challenge it. Right. But with black and brown folks, it's like, well, now I don't know. You might be hallucinating. Just have the humility to say there's some stuff I don't know. Fill me in. We would do that. Like if my toilet backs up, I call the plumber. And when the plumber comes, I don't look over his or her shoulder like, I think you're doing that wrong. Right. What the hell do I know? Well, that person's the plumber. Shut up and let them plumb.
Right. And that's the essence of this show. And that's why you're answering my questions and not the other way around, Tim. But I mean, the way I apply that directly when it comes to the racism of Donald Trump, and I'll be in an argument with somebody who will argue that he's not a racist, and they'll point to all the same arguments that he makes about college investment, historically black universities, opportunity zones, and whatever else that they say, unemployment numbers and so on. And they'll say to those statistics, I'll say, listen, if you want to know whether or not he's racist against black people, ask 9 out of 10 black people. Like, why are we talking about it? I don't know. If you want to know if he's sexist against women, ask what most women think. Why are we talking about it? And when I say that to people, they will still have something to say about his racism, his sexism. So, and I'm not just talking about Trump. I'm talking about those ideas in general. If you want to know what is racist or what is sexist or what is ableist, as you mentioned, then you would ask the people from the community who are discriminated against. I mean, what am I getting wrong when I use that tact? How could I make that better, more understanding, more convincing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Look, nothing that Donald Trump, quote unquote, did for black people is anything that Democrats and his opponents wouldn't have done, only bigger. Like all the criminal justice reform, Obama would have loved to have done that. And Obama, by the way, I don't think he was any kind of godsend for the black community. But let's be clear. But there's nothing that was in that bill that Barack Obama wouldn't have done. But there was no way the Senate was going to allow that to happen under an Obama administration.
Absolutely.
The same thing with all of the opportunity zones. First of all, the overwhelming majority of money in that is not going to black people. It's going to white real estate developers. Surprise, surprise, who are not, in fact, hiring black people on those construction crews to build those buildings. It is projects that were already going to exist that now are being made cheaper for the developers to build buildings that are going to, spur gentrification in black and brown communities. So this is not some real help to the black community, but whatever it is stuff that liberals and progressives and Democrats would have done 5 times larger if the Senate of the United States would allow that to happen. Right. So there's literally nothing he's done. But your point is well taken. Look, black people have had to know for 400 years who was on their side and who was not, because their lives literally depended on it. And they also knew that some of the folks who were on their side still had some racism in them. Like there were plenty of white abolitionists who still had racist views about black folks, but black folks were smart enough to know, like, well, we're going to work with you anyway, because even though you're not perfect, we know you're on the right side, right? Same thing in the civil rights movement. Black folks have had to know who are the actual allies and who are not. So to say that suddenly 9 out of 10 black folks who think Donald Trump is a racist and not working in their interests suddenly don't know what they're talking about is itself a racist argument, because what it says is black people are not smart enough or emotionally detached enough to understand their own interests.
Right.
That is a fundamentally racist argument. You're basically saying y'all are like children. You just don't understand that we're here to help you. Right. The vast majority of black folks obviously see it differently. So either they're irrational and unintelligent, which if you believe that, you're a racist, or they know what they're talking about and maybe you're the racist, right? I mean, it's one or the other.
Yeah, it's again, so well explained, Tim, and off the cuff. I just love talking to and listening to you, and Tim, of course, and reading you, and everybody should get dispatches from the race war. It's like where I break in the middle of the interview and do a live read for my actual guest, in this case, writing. Tim's, if you like what he's saying right now and you like listening to Tim, you'll love reading him and reading in general. I mean, I think that's another thing that we can do. Again, I didn't choose to be born in the community I was born into. I didn't choose to be born, as I always like to say, into this almost perfect vessel that I embody with such low body fat, amazing symmetry in my face. And I don't choose hair. It's better without it, which makes me more elite. I didn't choose it. Didn't choose this sleek, smooth physique. The point is, if I want to understand how the other part of the world lives, one really important thing I learned to do, because my older brother taught me to, Tim, read. Who can we tell them to read? What should my daughters be reading? If they're not going to experience it in their life because there's not enough diversity or because of the implicit biases that we all have, and obviously because of how addicted we are to media, and I mean 5-second and 10-second videos, what should we be reading? What really is indelible to white folks especially?
Well, definitely Ibram Kendi, How to Be Anti-Racist, Carol Anderson, White Rage, Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, is, I think, maybe the best book I've read on race ever, because what she really breaks down, and it's so critical in this moment, is the way that our racialized system is really much more akin to a caste system. We think of caste in terms of India, right? But really, that's what we've had. And the reason that's such an important distinction is caste is such a symbolic thing, right? That helps explain why working class and struggling white folks will oftentimes throw their lot in with the affluent and with the party that represents the interest of the rich. No one ever can understand that, right? You have the Bernie Sanders type folks and sort of progressive white lefties that are like, why are they voting against their interests? And what Wilkerson says is, you don't get it. They don't define their interests the way that you do. They have actually been encouraged to think of their interest as related to this right here, to skin, to their caste. Caste trumps class, no pun intended, so that they're not thinking of their interest that way. In fact, quite honestly, and I've said this for many years as well, in a society where you're encouraged to identify with the winning team, right? You're encouraged to support the winners. If I give you a choice of identifying with your class interest as a worker, in which case that's the losing team, right? The workers are losing, the owners are winning, the workers are losing. If I'm asking you to identify with the loser, but you've got another identity where you're the winner, you're white, you're a dude, you're a Christian, you're straight, you're on team winning on all these other things. And I'm saying, forget that, go with the losing team. What are the odds you're going to do that? No, you're going to stick with the teams that make you feel better, that make you feel like a winner, right?
Or so can I go talking about? Let me try to just explain that because I've always thought this as in terms of talk radio host. You're a truck driver and you're listening to Sean Hannity or Rush Limbaugh, and they're telling you that you should support lower tax rates for super wealthy people. A lot of times, I think liberals have made the mistake that arguing that they do that because they think they're going to be there someday. I actually think it's because they believe that those people worked the hardest to some extent and deserve it in a way. I don't know if that's true.
It's a little of both. It's a little of both.
It's part of it.
Sometimes you will hear those folks say, no poor person ever gave me a job. So yeah, that's true. But I think sometimes it is also that feeling. I mean, it could be one of two things. The feeling that maybe one day I'll own the trucking company. But you know what else it is? It's the opposite of that. Let's say that as a progressive lefty organizer, I do a really good job demonstrating to you how severe the class system is, because that's my job, right? Mm-hmm. To show you how the top 1% are ripping you off. And let's say I do a great job of showing you how powerful the top 1/10 of 1% are. There's also the possibility that precisely because I convinced you of that, you may decide, well, shit, I can never get a better deal in that game. Let me go play a different game. Let me go play the white guy game, where I'm a big dude in the plant. I may not have much, but at least I'm not black. At least I can speak English. At least I blah, 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 blah. At least I'm straight. At least I'm Christian, right? And so the problem is the more convincing we on the left are about how horrible the class system is, the more that some people might just say, screw it, man. I'm just going to opt for a whole different game that I can potentially win because I'm never going to win this one. So it actually, can backfire. And we just got to understand, I think Wilkerson's book, Caste, does such a good job explaining the symbolic importance and the real material value of caste status, which means we're going to have to rethink if we're going to get those struggling white folks on team justice. And I'm not saying that they can't be brought over, but you're not going to bring them over with a simplistic class appeal because they will cling to this other thing. You're going to have to talk to them about how the thing that they support is actually harmful to them right now. Right. And the good news is there are ways to do that. Like white communities are dying because of the opioid crisis. You're not just dying as workers, you're dying as white people, right? You're dying as white people who took your eye off the ball for 40 years because drugs to you were what happened over there and you didn't give a shit. Let's lock them up. And now they're happening to you. There are ways to talk about these issues that don't have to wait for the revolution, right? It's not about saying, well, if we just had a revolution and a major transformation of society, you would have better wages. Screw that. You're dying now. Your communities are dying now. You're hurting now. Let's talk about that. And maybe we can dislodge, 20% of those white folks. 80% might be lost, right? 80% of those folks that voted for Trump, they might be the folks that are just, frankly, they're not reachable. But if you reach 20% of them with a message that tries to show solidarity between their needs and the needs of black and brown folks, right? Then all of a sudden, this coalition is not winning by 5 million votes. Right. This coalition is winning by 15 million votes. You're not squeaking out victories in 4 and 5 states. You're winning massive victories. You're taking over all the powers, levers of power, and you're dictating the agenda. And you're not having to worry about what somebody thinks who believes that there's a child sex dungeon under Comet Pizza. Yeah. Right? You just ignore those folks and you know what? You can get them the mental health resources they need because you can get Medicare for all, which would include mental and emotional health care. And we can take care of them forever. We can do that. I'm all for that. I'm very compassionate. I want to make sure that every QAnon loon has got absolute 100% free of charge mental health and emotional health care for life, them and their children, all of them.
By the way, that reminds me, I now have to do a live read for Mike's Child Sex Dungeon, which is in Philadelphia, right near Four Seasons Landscaping in the dildo shop. Mike's Child Sex Dungeon. Bring your kid. I can't. I tried to improv it, but I don't know. I'm not a horrible enough person to think about what could be done to those children. So it's crazy that people do believe that. And as we have this conversation about wanting to learn and wanting to be curious, it really is interesting. And I feel like we always sadly have to talk about how far some people have gone, how far we have lost them, Tim, down the conspiracy wormholes of QAnon and JFK Jr. and adrenochrome. And like when we talk about race, you're always generally trying to talk about people who are vulnerable to some extent to what you're talking about, researching, living and teaching and writing. But how do we connect with these people? I mean, when you say people are lost, there's no way to get to them. I mean, what do? I
don't want to suggest that when I say they're lost, I mean that the amount of time it would take for someone to put in to reach them with rationality is not going to be worth it. I think everyone's redeemable. I really do. I think virtually every human being is redeemable.
I want to believe that.
You don't believe that?
I think murderers and rape, like I always use that for about murderers and rapists, and people have done one or several horrible things. But I feel like sometimes people, when they're so brainwashed into a certain, like Kenneth Copeland, is he redeemable?
Yeah, that guy. Right. Yeah.
Look him up, folks, and you tell me if you think he's redeemable.
And Paula, what's
the woman who speaks
Jonathan
in tongues.
Cain's wife, right? The one who, you'd think her royalties from Don't Stop Believin' would make it possible for her to shut down her ministry, but I guess not.
The only thing that makes me think Trump is somewhat sane is when she puts her hand on his shoulder and he's like, okay, get off me, crazy.
Right, exactly. But I think everybody, I have sat on death row, with people who have committed murder, and I do think that those are redeemable human beings. So I have to think that, Jimbo down the street that voted for Trump is too, right? But the thing is, I don't think that I don't think people like that, I think at least a lot of them, I don't think are going to be gotten and brought over to a different politic by the presentation of facts and information, or because they read my book or any of the books written by folks of color that I just mentioned a second ago. I don't think that's going to do it. I think people like that typically have to have their own sort of come to Jesus moment, so to speak. And I've known people like that. I've known people, I count among my friends and associates at least a half a dozen former neo-Nazis and white supremacists.
Sure. And if they can be de-radicalized or have an experience, or Jesus, watch Selma, like watch a movie.
But it was an experience, right? In each of their cases, if you talk to them, they will tell you it wasn't because somebody handed them a book or they watched a movie or they got some statistics or data. It was always because of some really sort of random thing where somebody was really kind to them who they didn't really deserve kindness from, right? So whether it was a person, and look, black and brown folks have no obligation to be nice to Nazis, and Jews have no obligation to be nice to Nazis. But the evidence says that it's usually these random encounters where someone is kind to them that flip them. I don't think we can count on that as a mass movement strategy. It worked for those half dozen folks, and it might work for a couple hundred more. Is that going to flip 70 million? No. But what might suffice here is to say, listen, let's drill down on those folks that are reasonable and willing to have a conversation among those who voted for Donald Trump. Who are they? Well, I don't know that we ought to put a huge amount of effort into that. Like I've been tweeting a lot the last couple of days. I'm tired of this notion that it's the job of the left to reach out to the diners in Nebraska and find out at the truck stop why they think the way they think, because they're never asked to do that, right? They're never asked to reach out to us. Nobody ever asked the Republican Party, why don't y'all go sit at the bodega, or why don't y'all go sit at the barbershop in the black community or the church or whatever and find out why these folks don't like you. They never get told to do their outreach. So I'm not for this one-way outreach thing. However, from a movement perspective, from a movement building perspective, we obviously want to have a broader coalition rather than a narrower one. And so from a movement perspective, we do want to figure out how do we bring in just enough. Doesn't have to be the majority of Trump people. Doesn't even have to be 40% of Trump people. Might only be 10 or 15 or 20%. That will change the dynamics of the country politically. And I think there will be 10% of those, 15% of those who can be brought over with messages that stress the damage that white supremacy and inequality do to all of us. And we're seeing that with the opioid crisis. We're seeing that with the way that economic globalization, which was hurting black communities and brown communities beginning in the mid 70s and the early 80s when those jobs started to flee. And if this country had taken that seriously 45 years ago and 40 years ago, the rot would not have spread to these little white towns where the plants closed, right? We could have taken care of business on the front end when it was hurting black folks, and then your white ass would still have a job. But we didn't. That's the conversation we can have. And maybe 80% of the Trump people are going to ignore it. But if 10 or 15 or 20% are down for that, then we're talking about at the margins really building a bigger and more effective movement.
In your book, Dispatches from the Race War, one of the essays you have is you may not be racist, but your ideology is why modern conservatism is racist. Tim, can I challenge you to distill systemic racism down to 2 minutes and 20 seconds so I can release the video on Twitter?
Well, systemic, separate from that piece, because that piece is really about how conservative ideology is sort of intrinsically racist, which is a whole nother conversation. I mean, systemic racism, look, is just the way in which the combination of the history of racial inequity and the reality of contemporary disparities combine to produce ongoing inequalities in outcomes of life between white folks and black and brown folks. The best example of this, right, is we have a long history, which nobody denies, of unequal opportunity for black folks, let's say, to housing access. We know that in the middle of the 20th century, not only were black folks redlined and not allowed to get loans in certain neighborhoods, but they also were denied government-backed loans that would have allowed them to move into suburban areas, FHA loans, VA loans, GI Bill benefits. What happens is when white folks were subsidized to get those loans and black and brown folks were kept in the cities unable to get those loans, that then affected what? It affected job access because the jobs were also moving to the suburbs. So now the white folks who were able to get better housing were also able to get better jobs. And then that affects schooling because then the resources for the K-12 schools were going to be better in those communities. That affects health outcomes. So now what you have is you have every single one of these institutions, housing, labor markets, education, healthcare, et cetera, combining to produce disparity, even if there are no more overt racists in the picture. Even if there wasn't another overt bigot, the weight of history has produced this inertia. Newton's first law of motion, right? An object in motion tends to remain in motion. That applies not just to dominoes when you knock them down and they, knock each other down. It also applies to the socioeconomic universe. We have to attend to that. That's what we mean by systemic racism.
You're talking about and you have an essay on Medium about that that people should read, but you're talking about the idea that redlining and making it harder for black folks to buy homes, the inertia that created, that's affecting black folks today. If my daddy didn't have a home to give me that I could benefit from, then I'm going to be affected today. But there are plenty of examples from today of systemic racism as well, right?
Oh, right. Well, and they all are related to one another. And part of it is the inertia. And the other is that, first of all, when you have the inertia that creates disparity, then when you combine the inequality, so let's say you have these inequalities that are the result of history, right? Now we live in a society where, as I mentioned before, we judge people on the bottom for being on the bottom and we praise people on the top for being on the top. So what happens is we look around and we go, well, look how these people are living. They must be inferior. So now it triggers the idea that we don't want to expand opportunity. In fact, we want to continue to hoard the opportunity up here because these people must be better. So this becomes a self-reinforcing thing where discrimination in the present starts to make sense to people based on the outcomes of the past. You say, well, I'm looking at the end of the race and the white people won the race, and so they must be better, because you're ignoring all the reasons why, the fact that certain folks had those head starts. And so it becomes self-reinforcing in the labor market. It becomes self-reinforcing in the housing market. In the housing market, you say, for instance, well, these folks don't have credit scores that are as good, or they don't have any credit history at all. Well, you don't get a bonus on your credit score if you pay your rent on time for 20 years, if you pay your light bill on time for 20 years. It doesn't help you. If you don't pay those bills and they get sent to collection, that'll hurt you. But if you've been a renter because you haven't had access to home ownership, you might not have a credit score. Whereas a 16-year-old white kid whose parents got them a credit card when they were junior in high school to help them build a credit profile doesn't have that problem.
Right.
So that's how the past affects the present and then ends up justifying unequal treatment today because the lenders go, well, it's not personal. It's not that we don't like black people. It's just you don't have the same credit history as this person does, right?
Wow, that's a spot-on impression of the lenders, by the way.
Yeah, I know. Isn't that great? That was
But I mean, you could talk about college admission, which you've written extensively about. You can talk about health outcomes. You can talk about educational opportunity in terms of where the universal pre-Ks are. Talk about defunding the police. Shift some of that money over to universal pre-K, specific policy, education policy. That makes a huge difference, according to education experts in the data, by the time you're 18. So those are parts of the system that today, not to mention the drug war and mass incarceration. I mean, that stuff is happening today. Preventing black folks from voting, striking down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. That today is systemic racism. How am I doing? I mean, aren't those examples of right now?
Yeah, those are examples of, I sometimes differentiate a little bit. I would call those examples of institutional racism in various institutions. So, for example, the voting restrictions, that's a form of institutional racism in the electoral system. The drug war is an example of institutional racism in the justice system. When those combine, that becomes systematized. So, and that's not how everybody defines it, but I try to differentiate.
No, I like that. I'm going to use that.
Individual racism is individual personal racism is bigotry. Institutional racism is standalone in one institution. Systemic racism is the interplay of those different institutions. So a good example would be, for instance, with the war on drugs being disproportionately aimed at black and brown folks as a form of institutional racism. We know that then affects labor markets because if you have a record, you're going to have a harder time getting a job. We know that 60% of employers say they would not knowingly hire someone with a record. So then that affects employment. It also affects access to college because you can't get loans if you have a drug conviction, for instance. So that's how these institutional factors, when they begin to intersect, they build on one another. And that's what I think of when I think of systemic racism.
So many other examples that we can talk about, but I love the way that you just explained the language, and I'm going to try to, as always, steal and adapt that from you. All right, let me just ask you this final big question, which is, you started to just answer it there. The difference between the way a person behaves and thinks in terms of their own prejudices and bigotry and, yes, racist views, and the way institutions, government, organizations operate, because people will often say, listen, I'm not a racist person. I have a lot of black people in my life. My brother married a black woman. I love her. I work with this guy, Tyrone, in accounting. He and I get along. He's probably my best friend at work. I grew up with these two black guys that I still keep in touch with. These are good friends of mine. I'm not a racist person, okay? I have lots of black people in my life. What do you say to that person who is still voting a certain way or thinking a certain way?
Well, you ought to ask your black friends how they feel about you doing that. I'd be curious to find that out. But also, as I've said before to you, and I think it's always worth repeating, having black people in your life or folks of color in your life, even genuinely good, close friends, doesn't absolve you of the possibility of either holding racist prejudice or acting in a racist fashion. Men who are heterosexual are married to, sleeping with, and dating women every day. And that doesn't mean that we can't be sexist or say and do sexist things. That's so obvious it shouldn't have to be said, but apparently it does have to be said because it's a direct analogy, right? The second piece is, and I've said this before, I can have black folks in my life, but if I'm not, if I'm not there when the cop pulls them over at 10 o'clock at night for being in the wrong neighborhood, if I'm not there when they go to the bank to get that loan and are more likely to be turned down, irrespective of their credit profile, irrespective of their occupational status and income, then what good is my friendship in that moment? I can go play ball at the gym with my black friend. We can sit around and shoot the shit at the sports bar. I can call them up. I can even have them over for holidays. But unless I'm there when the systemic institutional shit hits the fan, and I'm usually not, then what good am I? And if I'm voting for somebody who's going to make that shit hit the fan more often and more readily, then I'm doing real harm to my friend. And in the name of my friendship, I need to stop. Right? I need to stop that and think about what that friend needs of me in that moment.
You're now talking about, I think, the difference of saying, hey, listen, I'm not racist, or as opposed to I want to be an anti-racist. And when you give the examples that you give, I think those are great examples. You have the opportunity. You're not there. You're not at any of those in those moments to stand up, to say something, to do something, to call somebody. But you can vote. More importantly, I feel like every day there are things you can do to open opportunities and open doors. And I don't think this is in any way virtuous of me saying or doing. You can help folks who aren't in your club, in your community. There's any number of ways that you can help them, from sending money to literally introducing them to other people, to bringing them into your network, to giving them internships and jobs and so on. That's what anti-racism is. It is my understanding.
Right. Well, and a good example in the election, there were a lot of people who I heard interviewed in the 6 months leading up to this election who said, I'm appalled by Donald Trump's comments. I'm appalled by his Twitter, his behavior, some of his racism. But, my 401k is really off the charts booming and I'm making all this extra money. Here's the thing. Let's say that you voted for Trump and you weren't motivated by racism. You weren't motivated by xenophobia. You weren't motivated. But if you voted for someone because you looked around and said, yeah, I know he's a bigot, but I really need this tax cut. What you just said is that your priority is not your black friend whose life is at stake. Your priority is your bottom line. I got a tax cut from that tax bill that was passed a few years ago. I will gladly alleviate myself of the tax benefit if we can get universal health care and if we can get some justice for black and brown folks. And anyone who wouldn't do that, anyone who would say, because if you got a tax cut from that bill, you're making decent money, right? Anyone who would say in that moment, no, my retirement fund is more important than my black friend's life, or just black, even if it ain't my friend, just people of color's lives, is not really acting as a decent human being in that moment. They are saying that they're not willing to be anti-racist, that they're just going to throw up their hands and go, well, it's not a deal breaker for me. In that way, you're performing racism. You may or may not be a racist at your core, but I don't care. I know what you are performing. Racism is a verb, not just a noun. And you are doing it in that moment, whether or not that defines you. It's like I try to think of it the way I think of liars versus lying, right? We've all told lies. We've told lies to partners. We've told lies to friends. We've told lies to employers. We've told lies to people that were like, hey, let's get together for coffee. And we just didn't feel like it. And we're like, oh, I got a headache and I got something else to do. But if I were to say to you, like, have you ever lied and you told me a story about, yeah, I didn't want to get together with this buddy, I just didn't feel like it, I wouldn't probably say, well, you're just a liar. No, I would say, well, you lied, but that doesn't mean your core humanity is necessarily horrible. I'm willing to say most people's core humanity is decent. I really do fundamentally believe that. I really do think most people are good folks, but good folks do bad stuff all the time. And good people find themselves caught up in bad systems. And if I'm a good person with a good heart caught up in a bad system, it's a real open question whether I'm going to change that system or that system's going to change me.
Right. So well said. But just to put a kind of a point to that, what you said is when you said, I would be glad to give my tax cut back so that we could have a program that would help this group of people. I think a lot of people listening might say, go ahead, Tim Wise. So go ahead and give your money away. But the difference, people don't understand this, is, and a lot of rich folks do this. They give away huge sums of money to charities to absolve themselves of any, well, listen, look what I've done, or to their church. But that's not how systems work. An individual can give away all of their money and not change the system. You can feel good about yourself. You have to vote for and support
That's very important.
Yeah.
That's very important. Yeah. I mean, systemic change doesn't come from charity. Dr. King made this distinction between private charity and public justice, right?
Yeah.
And the truth of the matter is and I ain't one of those rich people who's got millions of dollars to give away. But even if all the ones who really were millionaires and billionaires were to give away all their money, we would still have these systems in place. It isn't enough. We need universal health care for all people, not just as a financial issue, but as a health related issue for the public. And you have to get the economy of scale that only taxation can provide. You cannot get the economy of scale to produce a more just healthcare system based on private charity, because I could give back all of my tax cut and that ain't going to pay for a week's worth of chemo or whatever. It's not going to pay for a liver transplant for somebody. It's not going to pay for, but if you get the economy of scale that comes from broad-based taxation, the good news is each of us has to contribute just a little bit more. It doesn't even require require a massive amount. And in fact, for most people, it won't require much more, if any more at all. But for those of us who have been fortunate enough to do well, we ought to be willing to kick in that extra 5% of our income. That's going to be the difference between the existing tax rate and the potential tax rate that could come in. And if we're not, even though we know that that would transform the outcomes for millions of people, then we're making a fundamental decision that our bank account, as fat as it already is relative to most people on the planet and most people in our own country, is more important to us than the lives of other people. That is a character flaw. And we ought to be able to speak of it as a character flaw and not be accused of hating the country. No, we love the country so much that we want everybody to be able to enjoy it equitably. That's like the most loving thing that you could possibly do. And the idea that we can just sort of give up our own money and, give up your own house, empty your own pockets like that. I would do that. And that still wouldn't solve the problem, right? It wouldn't solve the problem. The problem requires all of us. It requires a collective mentality. We do not solve systemic problems with individual actions. We solve systemic problems with systemic actions.
Tim Wise. Today's interview is brought to you by Tim's new book, Dispatches from the Race War. Go get it right now. Learn more. So great reading you. Always love reading your essays, and I'm super excited about this book. I want to do a book talk, book release, folks, with Tim, and he'll come and answer questions, and we'll have a great hangout, and I'm looking forward to doing that very soon. Tim, I cannot thank you enough. Another amazing, enlightening conversation where I really appreciate your time, pal. Thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
All right, Tim Wise, get the book. Follow him on Twitter and support him everywhere you can. You can support him on Patreon as well. And he's going to join me for a book talk. A book talk, like it's a bookstore, but it's not. And you can join me from all over the country, all over the world on Zoom. I don't have a date for it, but I did hear from his publisher. We are going to give away 5 copies of his new book, Dispatches from the Race War. So I hope that you'll join us for that, and I'll let you know as soon as I get a date for it. Okay, that's it for today. Please sign up to support the show, which still is ad-free. It's supported by you, the listener. Consider a paid subscription. Go to patreon.com/PeteDominic or the paid subscription link in the show notes and be a part of our community of curious, kind, passionate, often hilarious, and always brilliant folks who want to ask good questions to smart, experienced people. Let me know who you want me to have on the show, and give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, because that's where a lot of people, most people listen. If you listen there, make sure you have given it a rating. You're not alone. Join us on the Discord platform anytime, as if you are a subscriber, and join us Thursday night, 8 Eastern, for a Zoom hang to catch up, see where everybody's at and where we want to be and how we're going to get there. I'll see you there, I hope, and I'll talk to you in the Discord chat. You're not alone. I love you. Bye-bye.